Riddle me this. What's your favorite episode of Batman the Animated Series? Think about that for a second, and think about who wrote that episode, because chances are it was written by this man. Paul Dini wrote 30 episodes of BTAS, and many of them have become all-time fan favorites, including Heart of Ice, Almost Got Him, Over the Edge, Harley and Ivy, Baby Doll, and my personal favorite, The Laughing Fish. Paul Dini was arguably the best writer of the series and the DC animated universe at large, so you would imagine that when he started writing Batman comics in 2006, they would be some of the most groundbreaking, iconic, and celebrated Batman comics, right? Well, not exactly. For some reason, the 5 years Batman run of Paul Dini is, for the most part, ignored. It is really never mentioned or brought up at all in discussions about the most essential or greatest Batman comics, and the only thing people do talk about in this run is the storyline about Hush, which is absolutely great, but it's far from being the only good thing about it. These are some of the most underrated Batman comics ever, and today we're finding out why that is, and what's so good about the Forgotten Batman of Paul Dini. And it all starts in Detective Comics number 821, the first issue of Paul's run in Batman, where he started doing something different, as it is a full story told in one single chapter. Batman stumbles upon a series of murders against rich people, members of the high society who are killed in mysterious and brutal ways. The criminal behind the murders is a new villain called Facade, a man who commits the murders wearing a black leather mask that covers his entire face. But it's the fact that this villain is captured and stopped in this same story that is surprisingly rare. For many years before this, the Batman comics had featured long storylines and crossovers with multi-chapter adventures. It's a trend that began way back in the 1970s, but it became even more consistent and ambitious in the 90s and early 2000s. So when Paul Dini started writing Batman in 2006 and delivered a full story in one single issue, it didn't really work. As much as I'd love to say that this was groundbreaking and interesting and changed the game for Batman, well, it just didn't. There's nothing wrong with the story. In fact, it's a great detective story, with Batman working at night and Bruce Wayne following clues by day, mingling among the other rich people of Gotham to find and to stop the killer. It's a well-balanced story too, with enough clues to solve the mystery along with Batman, and simple enough to get it all done as a standalone chapter. But it's that same simplicity that works against it. This would have been a great story back in the old days of comics, when stories were done in one chapter, but unfortunately by the mid-2000s, comic fans wanted more. They needed longer and more complex stories, something that challenged them and allowed them to get invested in a series. And that's part of the reason why the early chapters of this run didn't really have a lasting impact, as all of them were standalone stories. These early chapters were also exclusively detective, mystery, and crime-driven stories, which was perfect for Detective Comics, showing why Batman is the best detective, outsmarting not just the criminals and the cops, but also a new private detective of Gotham. Starting in the second chapter of his run, Paul Dini introduces Edward Nygma as a reformed criminal, and turns him into a private detective that still uses the same Riddler gimmick. It's a fascinating and never-seen-before angle for the character that works perfectly, because all that Riddler ever wanted was to beat Batman, to prove that he was superior to the Dark Knight. But after failing time and time again as a criminal, he now decides to beat Batman in his own game. In other words, Nygma didn't stop being the Riddler, he just switched to the other side of the law to keep playing the same games with Batman. And that's what I love about this run, because Paul gets these characters. He knows they can't help themselves, and even when they try to change, they are still the same wacky and eccentric characters. The stories featuring Private Detective Riddler also feel like an extension of Paul's ideas from Batman the Animated Series, as he was also the writer of the episode Riddler's Reform, where Nygma apparently goes straight, but not really. It's a great way to bring the ideas of the TV show into the comics, and it's even better once I noticed that the letters in the captions of these comics use the same font of the letters of the animated series, which is a nice little detail that they didn't need to do, but it's very cool that they did. Detective Riddler was a very nice idea that allowed for a lot of funny moments and interactions with Batman. It was also a nice way of making the Riddler relevant again, because ever since the ending of Hush, DC Comics had no idea what to do with the Riddler, now that he knew the secret identity of Batman. So Paul Dini simply fixed that by bringing Riddler back and explaining that he spent the last year in a coma, and now he doesn't remember anything that happened in Hush, which is extremely convenient, but also a very funny and simple way to fix such a major problem. However, outside of this run, Detective Riddler was never really picked up by any other writer, and this lack of interest for Paul's ideas is a theme that we will see repeating itself over and over. For instance, in the next story, Paul created a new villain, a plant monster called Harvest, which was created by Poison Ivy, that was also never seen again. I really appreciate Paul introducing new and different enemies, but it's undeniable that he did his best work with the classic Batman villains like Riddler, Poison Ivy, and even the Penguin, who is back to being the owner of the Iceberg Lounge as another of Gotham's reformed criminals. But perhaps the most memorable one of these early stories was the one with the Joker, where he kidnaps Robin and takes him on a deadly ride across Gotham, killing dozens of innocent victims and doing all of that in a stolen car that Joker took from a family that he also kidnapped and killed. This story made me realize that Paul Dini is really good at telling horrific stories about the Joker, but still making them engaging, entertaining, and shockingly fun. Paul really captures the comedian side of the Joker, full of quirks, gags, and funny dialogue that makes you forget the monster he truly is and the horrible things he's doing in front of us. This is one of the darkest Joker stories that is also very easy to read, which is a massive accomplishment by itself. Take the ending, for example, where the Joker only stops killing when Robin starts talking about old comedy movies. It's so random, and that's exactly why it works. It's also one of the first stories where the bad guy is not captured at the end, opening the doors for a possible future encounter with the Clown Prince of Crime. But before that could happen, Paul wanted to tell a story about a Scarface, only there was one major problem about that. The ventriloquist was dead. Arnold Wesker, the original ventriloquist, was one of the many villains killed in 2006 in the storyline called Face the Face. So in order to actually use a Scarface, Paul Dini created a new ventriloquist as a beautiful young woman, who is also absolutely insane. She not only believes the Scarface is an actual person, but she's also deeply in love with it, creating multiple copies of the dummy for her to have and to hold any way she pleases, and trust me, she very much pleases to do it. In her first appearance, it's revealed that this lady took the original Scarface dummy and then she stole the corpse of the original ventriloquist to announce the return of Scarface in the most shocking way possible. And although Batman shows up in time to stop her, she still manages to escape, and only a few chapters later she makes a comeback, kidnapping Harley Quinn and making her part of their latest plan. And this is one of my favorite stories of this run, because although it seems like a typical villain team-up story between Scarface and Harley, it is actually so much more than that. The story opens with Harley trying to get the parole board of Arkham to approve her early release, as she has been mostly reformed, once again featuring the theme of reformed villains that Paul Dini loves so much. However, as part of the parole board, Bruce Wayne refuses to give Harley the early release, which works well for Scarface, as they break Harley out of Arkham and convince her to be part of their next criminal heist. And though it seems like Harley does join them, she actually double-crosses them and calls the cops as well as Batman to stop the ventriloquist. But here's where things get interesting, as Harley confronts the new ventriloquist and realizes that she actually loves the puppet. Harley even tries to talk some sense into her, telling her that loving a puppet is just as insane as loving the Joker, showing us the evolution and growth of Harley, as she's now rational enough to realize that she was crazy for loving Joker, comparing that with being in love with a puppet. The new ventriloquist, however, doesn't listen to reason, and she manages to escape once again. But that doesn't mean there's not a happy ending here, because in the aftermath of the story, Batman asks Harley why she betrayed Scarface, and I absolutely loved her answer. Harley tells Batman that she didn't like the new woman stealing the identity of Arnold Wesker, the original ventriloquist, because Arnold was the first person to show Harley some kindness and decency when she was first locked up in Arkham. It's such a small detail but so significant, because Harley saw the humanity of a person, when everyone else only saw the madness. It's a very touching moment and at the same time a heartfelt homage to the original ventriloquist, who was killed and thrown away like garbage in that other story. That's something that bothers me quite a lot, because as many of you know, the ventriloquist is my favorite Batman villain, so I will also take some time of this video to talk about him, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. Unless you pause the video. You didn't pause the video, right? Yeah, that's what I thought. The ventriloquist was always a fascinating villain to me, because he embodied the kind of madness that Batman has to deal with constantly. But at the same time, it's a character with an incredible potential for comedy and humor, as well as a touch of supernatural and horror, as the puppet was a funny satire of this stereotypical gangster who also seemed to have a life of its own, haunting the poor Arnold Wesker. The ventriloquist was created in the late 1980s, and the original stories of the character are some of the most entertaining Batman comics. For over a decade, the character became a constant villain in the Batman mythos thanks to the writer and co-creator Alan Grant. However, after Mr. Grant stopped writing Batman in the late 90s, nobody was able or interested in telling good stories about the ventriloquist. By the early 2000s, the character was mostly forgotten, and the few stories in which he appeared were downright terrible, showing a pathetic shell of a character instead of the funny, interesting, and twisted villain of the 90s. Eventually, DC Comics started a quest to kill many of the great Batman ideas of the 90s, including the death of Harold in Batman Hush, the death of a Spoiler in Batman War Games, the death of Tim Drake's dad in Identity Crisis, and the character assassination of Batgirl in the ending of her own series. And finally, the deaths of Magpie, the Cagey Beast, and the Ventriloquist, all of them in Batman Face to Face. It really was a rough time for Batman fans of the 90s, but out of all those deaths, the ventriloquist is the worst one, because he was not big enough to come back like Spoiler, but he was also not small enough to deserve death like Magpie. DC Comics simply decided to trash the ventriloquist because they couldn't see his potential, or if they did, they didn't care. And that's why I love this story, because even if it's for only 2 pages, Paul remembered Arnold Wesker. It was a nice homage and a proper send-off to one of my favorite characters, and this act of kindness and sanity allows Harley to finally get her release from Arkham, delivering the long-awaited happy ending. It's always a treat to read Harley Quinn stories written by Paul Dini. As the co-creator of the character, Paul truly loves writing Harley more than any other character, except maybe the Mistress of Magic herself. Even though she is one of the most important characters in the DC universe, Satana had never actually teamed up with Batman in the main Batman comics until this story, where Paul Dini brings together the Mistress of Magic and the Dark Knight to take down the Joker. As part of his new and complex plan, Joker impersonates a notorious magician and turns his magic shows into horror nightmares, with multiple people dying, but making it all look like an accident. As Batman starts investigating, he calls upon Satana to help him solve the mystery, and that's when they find out that the real magician is dead, and the Joker comes very close to killing Satana as well. Satana survived only thanks to her magic, and Batman then has to take good care of her, because it was his fault that she almost died. This situation brings the two of them closer, and once again, this is another one of Paul's ideas from Batman the Animated Series, where Bruce and Satana definitely had feelings for each other, but nothing really came to happen. Paul brings back that idea in this story, showing how much they do care for each other, but it also showcases them working together to stop the Joker before he could poison a large crowd of people. And this is one of those rare times where Batman uses supernatural forces and magic to take down one of his enemies, and it works incredibly well. I just can't get enough of these two and their dynamics, and the final showdown where Satana shows herself as a great sorceress is fantastic. At first glance, Satana might only look like a pretty showgirl, with the sexy fishnets and the silly top hat, but all of that is just part of her act to keep everyone distracted from the fact that she's actually a very powerful and badass magician. But besides all of that, what really makes this climax so great is the art. This story, as well as the majority of Paul Dini's run in Detective Comics up until this point, was illustrated by Don Kramer, who is one of the Batman artists that you will never hear about at all. And that's too bad, because Kramer was a pretty decent Batman artist, and I think that one of the reasons why nobody ever remembers Kramer is because none of the issues he worked on during this run featured his art on the covers. Instead, the covers of this run were done by the Italian artist Simone Bianchi, who created some interesting covers, but they had absolutely zero relation with the art of Don Kramer. The interior art of Kramer focused on action with big moments, colorful pages, and it was a bit cartoony too. The covers, on the other hand, were the complete opposite, with serious and somber monochromatic paintings that, in all honesty, are downright depressing. And that's probably one of the reasons why not many people read these early chapters, because it seems to me that DC scared a lot of potential readers with this choice of covers. And at some point I think they realized that, because all of that changed in 2008, when Detective Comics became part of the first big Batman storyline in over 3 years. It was called The Resurrection of Ra's al Ghul, and I'm sure it's pretty obvious what this one is about. The story is over 10 chapters long, and 3 of them were featured in Detective Comics. However, this was not really a Paul Dini story, as the whole idea behind it came from Grant Morrison, who was writing the main Batman title at the time, so this is not really the time or place to talk about this one. The only reason I bring it up is because that storyline marks a breaking point in Paul's run, as he slowly starts abandoning the idea of self-contained stories. He had already started doing that, as the Batman team-up with Zatanna was actually a 2-part story. But after the resurrection of Ra's al Ghul, these longer storylines became a lot more frequent, and the series also got Dustin Nguyen as the new artist, working on the stories as well as the covers, which are all fantastic. This was a major course correction, and all of these changes really paid off, because everything that came after this point is what people truly love and remembers about Paul's run in Batman. Starting with the Wonderland Gang, the story that expands the idea of Batman villains based on Alice in Wonderland. The Mad Hatter was already popular thanks to Paul's work in Batman the Animated Series, so once again he brought some of those ideas into the comics, creating new villains like the Walrus, the Lion and the Unicorn, and the best of them all, the Carpenter. Paul also brought back Tweedledum and Tweedledee, completing the picture for this wacky tale that is also Paul's last self-contained story. The following chapters all became longer and more complex, starting with a new ventriloquist story that shows exactly what happened to this woman and what led her to become the ventriloquist. Paul was always a genius when it came to giving villains tragic backstories, and this one is no different, allowing us to understand the pain and tragedy that turned Peyton Riley into one of Gotham's most wanted criminals. Unfortunately, Peyton apparently dies at the end of the story, and as it happened with many of Paul's ideas, nobody ever used this character again in any significant way. Now, as much as the story is about the ventriloquist, it is also about Batman and Zatanna, as the Mistress of Magic makes another guest appearance and the story really explores the possibility of a serious romantic relationship between them. In the end, both of them realize that as much as they love each other, they just can't be together because Zatanna wants something that Batman can't give her. Batman is not only too committed to his mission, but there's also someone else that comes first for him, and that's Selina. In the aftermath of the story, Catwoman returns to the spotlight, and she's quite jealous about Batman being seen around with Zatanna. This was an interesting way of introducing Catwoman into the run, exposing her feelings quite openly and showing that there's a lot of unresolved issues between them. This, however, was very intentional, because Catwoman was going to be the most important character in the next story, which is by far the most iconic of this run. Heart of Hush begins in issue number 846 of Detective Comics, and it immediately became the best Hush story ever created, no exaggeration. Every other Hush story that came before were all just bad, and yes, that includes the original Hush storyline. This one is the first story that actually explains who Hush is supposed to be and what his motivations really are, expanding the origin story of the character and taking it all the way back to the complicated childhood of Tommy Elliot. Heart of Hush was really the first origin story of Hush, and it is the crowning achievement of this run, as Paul Dini literally took a mediocre character that nobody understood, not even his own creators, and developed him in such a fantastic way that it completely turned him into one of the most interesting Batman villains. Paul Dini was basically the third co-creator of Hush, doing what nobody else before him could, fleshing out the character properly and creating a powerful story, where Tommy Elliot returns with the ultimate master plan to strike at the very heart of Batman by stealing the heart of Catwoman. Literally. It's a very strange plan that apparently comes out of nowhere. But then Hush himself explains how he came up with this plan after the Joker attacked him and put an explosive pacemaker in his own heart. That's a very weird explanation, but it's actually a reference to one of the many awful Hush stories from the series Gotham Knights in the mid-2000s. In that particular story, the Joker indeed attacked Hush and put an explosive pacemaker in his heart. This bizarre story was also the final one of Gotham Knights, and it was never finished because the stories were so bad that the series was cancelled. Obviously, Paul Dini read that story, for some reason, and it actually inspired him to create Heart of Hush. Basically, Paul took an awful and bizarre idea and turned it into one of the best Batman stories ever. Or, in other words, just a normal Monday for Paul Dini. Heart of Hush also features a small appearance by the Scarecrow and the return of Venom to the Batman comic since Nightfall. But the most important thing about it is the main plot of Batman trying to find Selina's heart to save her. And it's important because Batman needed to be reminded of his humanity. For the longest time, Batman had become too cold and distant, a dark Avenger who only cared about his mission. So the point of doing Heart of Hush was to show us the heart of Batman, which is appropriately Selina's heart. It's something so deeply romantic and tragic that only Paul Dini could pull it off. In fact, the story works so well because Paul incorporates almost all the other characters and elements of his run. The Wonderland Gang, the new ventriloquist as well as Satana all become part of this epic story, where Batman has to face the man that not only stole his heart, but also his face. This revelation is just the cherry on top, as Tommy Elliot reveals that he has been slowly doing plastic surgery on his face to turn himself into Bruce Wayne. That is perhaps the greatest moment of the story, as we finally understand how deep Hush's obsession with Bruce really is. It is so much more than just a silly childhood grudge. It's a lifetime of living under Bruce's shadow that drives Tommy to become Bruce himself, and finally explains brilliantly why he needed to cover his face full of bandages. Back when Hush was created, the character never made any sense, as his story was rather mediocre, and his character design was never actually explained. It was a very disappointing new character that didn't need to exist, but DC Comics insisted on creating this new villain without giving much thought into it. In the original Hush story, Tommy Elliot was presented as this evil kid right from the start, an evil boy that became an evil man without a good reason. So it's quite impressive how Paul Dini took this one-dimensional character and fully fleshed him out, giving him a tragic background where he was a victim of child abuse by an alcoholic father that would constantly beat him. This is something that immediately allows us to understand why Tommy tried to kill his parents in the first place, and as someone who went through that kind of abuse myself, I can't help but feel sorry for Hush. It's a weird feeling to have for a fictional character, but that's the power of Paul Dini's writing. It's almost like Paul's superpower is understanding these characters, writing about them as relatable humans and touching our hearts with their personal stories. Heart of Hush is the greatest example of this, quite literally showing us the heart of Tommy Elliot as well as Batman's own heart, which actually belongs to Catwoman. Normally, romance doesn't really have a place in the Batman comics, but in Heart of Hush, Paul Dini shows us just how it's done. This is definitely the most perfect romantic story between Batman and Catwoman by far. And the reason why it works so well is because it keeps the tender and mushy stuff to a minimum, focusing instead on Batman's relentless quest to save the life of the woman he loves and ending on an epic final showdown against Hush in Wayne Manor and the Batcave, where Hush has to fight not only the Batman family, but also the Batman history, as the trophies and the many vehicles of Batman's history are used against him. Naturally, Hush is defeated, but he's not captured, and only in the aftermath of the story, Bruce and Selina allow themselves to have a beautiful moment together, one of the last ones before Batman dies. While Paul Dini delivered one of the best Batman stories of the 2000s, outside of Detective Comics, Batman was fighting secret organizations and getting himself killed by Darkseid. This was all part of the epic dramas of 2008 called Batman R.I.P. and Final Crisis, where Batman died. In the wake of those stories, Paul Dini created the aftermath to Heart of Hush, where Tommy Elliot starts impersonating Bruce Wayne around the world, and thanks to his new face, he doesn't raise suspicions now that the real Bruce Wayne was secretly dead. The plan almost worked perfectly, but Hush was eventually discovered by Catwoman, who wanted payback for what he did to her. Selina then tortured Hush and kept him as a prisoner before giving him away to Nightwing and Robin, who decided to lock away the fake Bruce Wayne in a special room in Wayne Enterprises. And with that, Paul Dini's run in Detective Comics came to an end. Of course, with Bruce Wayne dead and Hush having the perfect face of Bruce, the story was far from over. And that's why DC Comics created a new series called Batman: Streets of Gotham, where Paul Dini and Dustin Nguyen continued their run together, but under very different circumstances. The Final Crisis and Batman R.I.P. completely changed the Batman mythos, leading directly to the Battle for the Cowl, an epic power struggle in Gotham that ended with Nightwing becoming the new Batman, and with Damian, the son of Bruce Wayne and Talia, becoming the new Robin. A new age for Batman had begun, and in 2009 the new dynamic duo started appearing across all the Batman comics. This was also the starting point of Batman: Streets of Gotham, a series that showed the evolution of Dick Grayson as he slowly adapted to the role of Batman, working as the protector of Gotham while also teaching Damian how to be a normal crime fighter. The dynamics between Dick Grayson's Batman and Damian's Robin was one of the focus of the early chapters of the series, showing them learning to work together and understanding each other. And although Damian comes across as this hot-headed little brat, with Dick Grayson doing his best to deal with him, these interactions were the necessary comedic relief that some of these stories required, because for the most part, the central plot of the stories were quite serious and dark. In the first couple of chapters, Batman and Robin had to stop Firefly, who had found a new way to burn people remotely, creating a raging inferno across Gotham. And not long after that, the heroes had to confront the vicious serial killer Mr. Zsasz, in the most ambitious and darkest story ever created about this character. It's honestly fascinating watching Dick Grayson go up against these villains and having so much trouble stopping them, while Bruce would have done it in no time. It's a fantastic way to show Dick's lack of experience when it came to the more dangerous villains, but it's also the perfect chance to show how Damian would deal with them. Damian was raised and trained by the League of Assassins, so he had no problem with killing. It was only thanks to his association with Batman that the boys stopped doing that. So this was the perfect chance to show what would happen when the murderous boy goes up against a ruthless serial killer like Zsasz. In order to make that happen, the story takes a really dark turn, when Mr. Zsasz reinvents himself as a criminal mastermind that gathers street kids and butchers them in an underground gladiator arena for the entertainment of criminals. It's definitely one of the most sickening and twisted Mr. Zsasz stories, which goes as far as allowing us to see through the eyes of the killer, showing us that he literally sees everyone as a potential victim and dead by his own hands. Even though it might look like a morbid and a bit unnecessary detail, it is absolutely necessary, because not only does it allow us to understand the character of Zsasz better, but it also pays off incredibly well in the climax of the story, when Damian goes up against Zsasz after he allowed himself to be captured, and becomes part of the twisted show. At first, Damian goes easy, trying to avoid killing, but soon he learns that was a mistake, because Zsasz is not like the other crooks of Gotham. He is an extremely dangerous killer, and once Damian understood that, he stopped holding back and unleashed all his pent-up rage in one masterful display of swordsmanship, slashing Zsasz to the brink of death and making Zsasz look at him in fear, forcing him to stop seeing Damian as a victim, but rather as his potential killer, and finally defeating him before Batman shows up. Damian has the potential of being a ruthless killing machine, and he definitely stole the spotlight in this story. But after such a cathartic storyline, the series took a bit of a break with a story about the Carpenter, one of the members of the Wonderland gang, who starts working as a contractor for villains, building their secret lairs and their deadly death traps. It's a fun story and a nice breather after the intensity of the previous 5 chapters. However, as all of this was happening, there was one running subplot during all that time, and it was the follow-up to the story of Hush. In the early chapters of the series, Hush managed to escape from his special prison, and he started posing as Bruce Wayne once again, only this time in front of the public eye, making news with big donations of billions of dollars to all sorts of charities and public organizations. Basically, Hush decided to turn Bruce Wayne into Gotham's favorite person, simply by giving away all the Wayne fortune to help the city, although his real intention was always to bankrupt and absolutely ruin the Wayne Empire. And I think it's funny that even though Hush gave away literally billions of dollars to the city, it didn't help at all. Gotham was just as dangerous and corrupt as always, so the next time someone brings up the hot take that Batman should use money instead of violence to fix the city, just tell them to read Streets of Gotham. Let them see for themselves that it doesn't work, because Gotham always ends up wasting the money in corruption instead of fixing the problems. That said, Dick Grayson could not just sit there and watch Hush give away free money and ruin the Wayne business, so he got a bunch of members of the Justice League to keep an eye on Hush, while he continued to make public appearances, allowing him to only make donations of millions instead of billions. All of these heroes would remain hidden in plain sight thanks to a magic spell by Satana, but one night Hush was allowed to go out only under Alfred's supervision, and they were both attacked by a small group of old-time gangsters who wanted revenge against Bruce Wayne, and so they ended up kidnapping Hush instead. This is how the final storyline in Streets of Gotham begins, the grand finale that culminates the epic saga of Hush and brings Bruce Wayne back. By 2010, DC Comics decided to revive Bruce Wayne, and with a real Batman back in action, Paul Dini took this chance to tell the final Hush story, where the problem about having two Bruce Waynes comes to an end, and Hush meets his fate in the storyline called The House of Hush. The story goes back to the past once again and reveals how exactly Thomas Wayne and Martha Kane met each other, in a situation that involved the Elliots as well as the young magician Satara. In their first encounter, it was clear that Thomas and Martha were from different worlds, but they eventually came together thanks to their mutual friend Leslie Tompkins. Thomas and Martha started working with Leslie in her clinic, and one day a group of gangsters attacked the place, trying to force Leslie to abandon the clinic. However, their plans were ruined and all of them were arrested. The leader of the gangsters would never forget that day, and more than 30 years later he's released from prison and decides to get his revenge against the Waynes by attacking their son, unaware that this is not the real Bruce Wayne. But the funniest thing to me about all of that is that the person who actually stopped the gangsters in the past was not Thomas or Martha, it was actually a really young Alfred Pennyworth. In any case, Hush disappears, and the heroes think this was all part of his plan to escape from them. With Hush missing, Batman needs to check up on Catwoman, and Selina was more than happy to see Bruce again. At long last, they are finally together, but their reunion is short-lived, as there's already another crisis in Gotham, with a new villain called Bedbug creating an army of sleepwalkers to commit crimes. Bedbug was one of the last new villains created by Paul Dini, but just as it happened with all of his other creations, nobody ever picked up this character, and after a couple of chapters, Bedbug simply disappeared. To be fair, the story was already overcrowded, and it was much more important to develop the story of Hush, who manages to convince the gangsters that kidnapped him that he's not Bruce, and becomes their leader in their vendetta against the real Bruce Wayne. Together, they also recruit the help of Dr. Death, one of the first Batman villains, but before they could put their evil master plan in motion, Hush betrays all of them and tries to eliminate Bruce all by himself. He came very close too, but then his own evil ways came back to bite him in one of the best twist endings in the Batman comics. And it all happened because back when Hush was throwing away Bruce's money, he also used Bruce's position as a member of the parole board in Arkham Asylum and allowed a dozen of dangerous lunatics an early release. Among the villains that Hush tried to get released was Jane Doe, one of the most twisted crazies of Arkham, a villain who removed her own skin in order to kill people and impersonate them by wearing their skin instead. This highly dangerous inmate was not released, but Hush's attempt at freeing her indirectly allowed her to escape, and ever since then she became obsessed with becoming Bruce Wayne. So naturally she infiltrated Wayne Enterprises by killing and impersonating one of Bruce's assistants, and then she found her way to Bruce himself, unaware that this was actually Hush. That's how Jane Doe gets the drop on Hush and removes his face so that she could wear it. But before she could kill him, Batman arrives and captures both of them, in one of the most convenient but well-executed endings. Convenient because this fixes the issue of having two Bruce Waynes, destroying the fake face of Hush and, once again, keeping his original character design, as Tommy Elliot now needs to wear bandages all over his face yet again. And not only that, the story also solves the major problem about Hush, which was the fact that he could expose the secret identity of Batman if he was ever arrested or taken to Arkham. Back when Hush was created in 2003, that was a big problem, but by 2011 things had changed quite a lot, with Bruce Wayne revealing to the public that he had been funding Batman. Hush could now be locked up safely because when he tries to tell people that Bruce is Batman, everyone thinks he's just confused and mentally disturbed. And that's how Tommy Elliot became just another inmate in the madhouse, the House of Hush. And that is also the ending of Paul Dini's run in Batman. And man, what a run it was! This is one of the most satisfying runs to go through and, at the same time, one of the most bittersweet. Because it's insane to me how good these comics are and yet how little people talk about them. This run always ends up coming after Paul's other more iconic and successful works, like Batman the Animated Series, the Arkham video games, and all of the comic book adaptations of these works. Even his run in Gotham City Sirens, a series that focuses entirely on the girls of Gotham like Harley Quinn, Catwoman and Poison Ivy is more popular. The Paul Dini run in Detective Comics and Streets of Gotham is definitely one of the most underrated in the history of Batman, and if it wasn't for the Hush stuff, this would truly be one of the most forgotten Batman runs ever. The work that Paul did with Hush is the same work that he did with Mr. Freeze in Batman the Animated Series, taking a very mediocre villain and turning it into something good, something interesting, making us understand and feel for these characters like never before. And that's only possible when you really love the stories you're creating. And that's why to me Paul Dini is perhaps the most passionate Batman writer of all time. Which makes it even more tragic that this run is so underrated. But it's also quite logical, because this run was not just overshadowed by Paul's other great work, but also by the other, more iconic, more groundbreaking and more memorable Batman run, which was being published at the exact same time. Of course, I'm talking about Grant Morrison's Batman, which is by now the most requested video in the history of this channel. And I say that because, for the last year and a half, there was at least one comment in all of my videos asking about Grant Morrison's Batman. So you can stop that now, because that's what we're doing next. For now, thank you so much for watching this video about one of my favorite Batman creators, and a special thanks to Thomas Murray, Wallscaler Batman, Caronade, John Papp, Kay, Marco Daniel, Gaetano Barreca, Ace Mowick, MP, and all of my Patreons. Thank you all so much for your support, and I will see you in the next one.